You ever hear a story that starts with a lie and ends with the truth? Not the easy kind of truth, but the kind that's been bought and paid for with gunpowder and blood. This is one of those stories. It's about an Apache marshal with a ghost in his eyes, a woman with a tongue as sharp as a razor, and a marriage certificate signed in desperation. They thought they were running from a gang of killers. They were wrong. They were running towards something much, much worse. And if their story grabs you, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It tells me you want more tales pulled from the dust in the dark. Now let's ride. The wind in San Miguel wasn't just wind. It was a warning. It carried the smell of burnt mesquite and something else. Trouble. Dan Cole felt it in his bones. A low hum of something wrong. Something about to break. He sat on his Mustang at the edge of town, his hat pulled low, his face a mask carved from stone and memory. Below him, the town shimmered in the heat, a single dusty street and a handful of buildings leaning on each other for support. Dan was 36, Apache by blood, and a U.S. Marshal by a cruel twist of fate. He used to scout for the Army, tracking his own people across the land of his ancestors. Now he wore a badge that felt heavier than any stone. It didn't make him friends. It just made him a target from all sides. He nudged his horse forward, down the path into the simmering pot of San Miguel. The stares hit him like physical things. Fear, hate, a little bit of respect maybe, but the kind of respect you give a rattlesnake. He didn't look back at them. His eyes were fixed on the telegraph office, where a corporal in a faded blue uniform was waiting for him, sweating in the shade. The corporal's name was Sitku, and he looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Marshal," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We got a situation. A woman. Rode in last night. Name's Cora Dweet." Dan's expression didn't change, but something tightened in his jaw. "She says she's being hunted. Asked for you by name." That was unusual. Nobody asked for Dan Cole unless they were out of options. "Hunted by who?" Dan asked, his voice low and rough, like stones grinding together. The corporal shook his head. "Wouldn't say, just terrified. Said her father was Franklin Dweet. You know him?" Dan swung himself off the Mustang, his boots hitting the dry earth with a thud that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "Yeah," he said, his voice tight. "I knew Frank." The corporal leaned in closer, his voice dropping even more. "He's dead, Marshal. Shot down outside Yuma. She says she saw the whole thing." A cold knot formed in Dan's gut. Frank DeWitt. A man of 100 secrets and 1,000 regrets. A man Dan owed a debt to, a debt he could never repay. "Where is she?" he asked. The corporal pointed a shaky finger toward the old whitewashed mission at the end of the street. "In there, barricaded herself in. The preacher's with her, but she says she won't talk to anyone but you." Dan didn't say another word. He just adjusted the rifle on his shoulder and started walking toward the church. Every step crunched on the grit and glass littering the street. Every step felt like he was walking toward a past he tried to bury. He pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped into the hot, dim silence of the chapel. And there, sitting in the back pew, was a woman who looked like she was ready to fight the devil himself with her bare hands. She looked up the moment he entered, and her eyes, deep and fierce, locked onto his. It felt like two guns being drawn at the same time. There was no fear in them, just pure, uncut fury. "So you're the famous Dan Cole," she said, her voice flat and cold. "The man my father trusted." She stood up, a leather notebook clutched in one hand. She wasn't tall, but she stood like she was. "I'm Cora Dweet, and you're the last man on earth I want to see right now." Dan stopped a few feet away, his shadow stretching long in the candlelight. He didn't understand. "You asked for me," he said simply. She gave a bitter laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "My father asked for you, in a letter he wrote before they killed him. He said if I was ever in trouble, I should find you. Said you were the only man alive who could read his lies." Dan's mind reeled. Frank's lies? What did that mean? "What are you talking about?" Cora held up the notebook. "This." He called it his ledger, but it's not numbers. It's a code. And whatever it says, men are willing to slaughter a dozen people to get their hands on it. "They killed my father for it. They'll kill me for it too. Dan's eyes were fixed on the book. He'd seen it before years ago. Frank had always kept it close. They're coming for you, Dan stated, not a question. They're already here, she shot back. I saw one of them by the livery, a man with a scar on his face. He was watching this church. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken questions. Dan knew that scar. He knew the man who wore it, a man named Briggs, who rode with a ruthless gang led by a monster named Rattlesnake Jack. Just then, the preacher, Reverend Crane, stepped out from the side altar, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. Marshal, we have a problem, he said, his voice trembling. The army won't protect her. They say it's a civil matter, and I can't keep her here. These men, they'll burn this place to the ground to get to her. Cora's jaw was set. She looked at Dan, a challenge in her eyes. So what's the plan, Marshal? You going to deputize me and start a war? Before Dan could answer, the Reverend cleared his throat. There is another way, an old territorial law from 47. It states that if an unmarried woman is without family and under direct threat, a local law officer can assume guardianship through emergency matrimony. Cora stared at him, dumbfounded. Then she burst out laughing, a raw, angry sound. You want me to marry him? This walking tombstone? You've got to be kidding me. The Reverend looked pained. It's not a marriage of the heart, Miss DeWitt. It's a legal shield. As his wife, you'd be under his official protection. It would give him the authority to transport you across state lines to requisition aid from any federal outpost without waiting for orders from Washington. Cora turned to Dan, her eyes blazing. I asked for a protector, not a husband. Dan met her gaze, his own expression unreadable. You didn't ask for me at all, he said quietly. Your father did. The words hung in the air between them. Her father's last wish. The weight of it was suffocating. She looked from Dan's stoic face to the Reverend's pleading one, and then back to the notebook in her hand. She was trapped. Fine, she spat out, the word tasting like poison. Fine. If it keeps a bullet out of my back, I'll sign your stupid paper. She stabbed a finger in Dan's direction. But you and I need to be clear on a few things. I don't cook, I don't clean, and I take orders from no man. Got it? Dan gave a single, slow nod. I don't give orders. Reverend Crane let out a shaky breath of relief and hurried to the altar, fetching a worn Bible. Shall we begin? He asked. Cora and Dan looked at each other, their expressions identical masks of grim resignation. No, they said in perfect unison. The Reverend managed a weak smile. Excellent. Then it's a proper Western wedding. As they stood before the altar, the words of the ceremony felt like a curse, each vow a chain link snapping into place. They didn't have rings. They didn't have romance. They had a shared enemy and a ticking clock. And just as the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, a single sharp sound cut through the afternoon haze. The sound of a horse, riding hard and fast, coming straight for the church. Cora's blood ran cold. Dan's hand went to the pistol at his hip. The killers weren't coming. They were already here. The rider didn't stop. He thundered past the church, a blur of dust and motion, and for a second they thought he was just passing through. Then a small cloth pouch landed on the steps of the mission, tossed with casual menace. Dan was moving before it even hit the ground. He shoved Cora behind the altar, his rifle already in his hands. Stay down, he commanded, his voice a low growl. He crept to the heavy oak doors, peering through a crack in the wood. The street was empty. The rider was gone, vanished as quickly as he'd appeared. The dust was already settling. After a long, tense minute, Dan opened the door and retrieved the pouch. It was simple leather, tied with a string. Inside was a single, spent bullet casing and a crudely drawn picture of a rattlesnake. A message. A promise. It's from Jack, Dan said, his voice grim as he showed it to Cora. He knows you're here. He's telling us we can't run. Cora's face was pale, but her eyes were still burning with defiance. So we fight. We will, Dan said, but not here. Not in a town full of people who will get caught in the crossfire. He looked at the Reverend, who seemed to have aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. Is there a back way out of here? A place we can get to the horses without being seen? The Reverend nodded numbly. The old Friar's Passage. It leads to the stables behind the livery. Dan turned back to Cora. Pack whatever you can carry. We ride in 5 minutes. She didn't argue. For the first time they were a team, united by the cold certainty of the threat outside. They moved through the dark, musty passage, a tunnel that smelled of damp earth and forgotten prayers. The only sound was their breathing and the scuff of their boots on the stone floor. When they emerged into the blinding sunlight behind the livery, the world seemed deceptively peaceful. Dan moved with a speed and silence that was unnerving. He had their horses saddled and ready in minutes, his movements economical and precise. He handed Cora the reins to a sturdy-looking mare. "Can you ride?" he asked. She shot him a look of pure irritation. "I've been riding since before I could walk. Don't treat me like a porcelain doll, Marshal." He almost smiled. Almost. "Good," was all he said. They mounted up, keeping the livery between them and the main street. "Where are we going?" Cora whispered, her hand hovering near the pistol she now wore at her hip. It looked heavy and unfamiliar, but she held it like she was willing to learn. "Painted Mesa," Dan replied. "It's rough country, my country. We'll have a better chance of losing them there." They slipped out of town like ghosts, following a dry creek bed that shielded them from view. The sun was a brutal hammer in the sky, beating down on them without mercy. For the first hour they didn't speak. The only sounds were the creak of saddle leather and the plodding of hooves on sand. The silence stretched, becoming its own kind of conversation. Cora kept glancing at the man riding beside her. He rode with an easy grace, a part of the horse, a part of the landscape, but his eyes were never still. They scanned the horizon, the rocks, the shadows, constantly searching, constantly aware. He was a hunter, but right now he was the hunted, and so was she. Finally, she couldn't take the silence anymore. "So," she said, her voice raspy from the dust, "you and my father, you rode together?" Dan kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "For a time, scouting contracts for the army. He ever talk about me?" The question was quiet, vulnerable. Dan hesitated for a fraction of a second. "No." The word was blunt, final. Cora flinched as if he'd slapped her. She turned her face away, but not before he saw the flash of pain in her eyes. The silence that followed was worse than before. It was thick with disappointment. After a few more miles, she spoke again, her voice sharp with renewed anger. "Well, that's just perfect. The man was a ghost my whole life. Turns out he was a ghost to his friends, too." Dan glanced over at her. "He wasn't a man who used a lot of words," and he said. It was the closest he could come to an apology. She scoffed. "He was stubborn and reckless, and full of secrets he'd rather die than share. But he was my father. He taught me how to read the stars and how to shoot a bottle off a fence post. Then he'd vanish for years at a time." She looked at Dan, her gaze intense. "You're just like him. Quiet, brooding. Is that why he trusted you?" Dan's jaw tightened. "I don't know why he trusted me. It doesn't matter. All that matters is keeping you alive." "Oh, how wonderfully romantic," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "This fake marriage is off to a roaring start." They stopped at noon to water the horses at a small, muddy spring. As Cora drank from a canteen, she pulled out the leather notebook. She opened it, the pages filled with her father's strange, cramped handwriting. It was a mix of symbols, star charts, and what looked like fragments of poetry. "Have you ever seen this before?" she asked, holding it out to him. Dan looked at it, his expression unreadable. He was always writing in it, never let it out of his sight. She pointed to a passage. "Where the stone eagle weeps at noon." What the hell is that supposed to mean? Before Dan could answer, a sound made them both freeze. A distant but unmistakable sound. A gunshot. It was followed by another, then a volley. It was coming from the direction of San Miguel. They were miles away, but the sound carried clearly in the thin desert air. Cora's face went white. "They're sending another message," she whispered. Dan was already grabbing the reins. "It's not a message," he said, his voice dangerously low. "It's a massacre. They're not just after you anymore. They're wiping out anyone who might have seen you, anyone who might have helped you." He swung into his saddle, his face a grim mask. They're burning the town to cover their tracks. Let's ride, now. They spurred their horses, galloping away from the sound of the slaughter, the smoke from San Miguel rising in a dark column behind them, a funeral pyre for the life Cora had left behind. The desert became their sanctuary and their prison. They rode until the horses were slick with sweat and their own bodies ached with a weariness that went bone deep. The smoke from San Miguel was a constant accusation on the horizon behind them. Dan pushed them relentlessly, his face set like flint, his eyes scanning every ridge, every shadow. He knew this land, every rock and ravine, and he used it to their advantage, taking paths that weren't on any map, paths that only the Apache knew. Cora matched him stride for stride. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was being burned away by a simmering rage. They had taken her father. Now they were destroying an entire town because of her. She wouldn't break. She wouldn't let them win. That night they made a cold camp in a narrow canyon, the rock walls rising up on either side like giant, silent sentinels. They didn't risk a fire. The moon was a sliver of bone in a black sky, offering little light and no comfort. Cora huddled in her blanket, the leather notebook clutched to her chest. It was the cause of all this, and maybe, just maybe, the key to ending it. This book, she said quietly into the darkness. I think it's more than just a code. I think it's a map. Dan was a dark shape a few feet away, cleaning his rifle with practiced, efficient movements. A map to what? I don't know. Gold? Weapons? My father was always chasing something, some secret that was supposed to make us rich, make up for all the years he was gone. She sighed, a sound of pure exhaustion. It never did. She opened the notebook, tilting it to catch the faint starlight. Look at this. He sketches constellations, but they're wrong. The stars are in the wrong place. But if you connect the dots, she trailed a finger across the page. It's not a star chart, it's a landscape. See? This cluster of stars. It looks like that three-peaked mountain we passed this afternoon. Dan stopped cleaning his rifle. He moved closer, crouching beside her to look at the page. She could feel the heat radiating from him in the cold night air. He smelled of dust, leather, and something else. Something wild and dangerous. He traced the lines on the page with a calloused finger. The needles, he said, his voice a low rumble. And this circle with the slash through it. It's an old trail marker. It means water below, danger above. Cora stared at him, a new kind of respect dawning in her eyes. You can read this? Some of it. It's a mix of things. Surveyor's symbols, army shorthand, and... He paused. And what? She pressed. And Apache pictographs, glyphs. He's marking a trail, but it's not leading to gold. His voice had gone quiet, intense. This symbol here, he pointed, it means sacred ground, a place of spirits, a place you do not enter. A shiver went down Cora's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Her father, a man who believed in nothing but profit and loss, was using sacred Apache symbols to mark a path. It didn't make sense. Why? She whispered. Why would he do that? Dan looked up from the book, his dark eyes meeting hers in the gloom. I don't know, but whatever he found out here, it was important enough to get him killed, and it's something Jack will stop at nothing to get his hands on. He straightened up, his silhouette framed against the star-dusted sky. You ever been married before, Marshall? She asked suddenly, the question popping out of her before she could stop it. The change of subject was so abrupt it seemed to startle him. He was silent for a long moment. No, he finally said. Why not? She prodded, genuinely curious about the man behind the badge. He looked away toward the dark mouth of the canyon. Never found a woman who wanted to share a roof with a man who brings the war home with him every night. The raw honesty of his answer silenced her. It was a glimpse behind the stone wall he kept around himself. What about you? He asked, turning the question back on her. She gave a short, bitter laugh. Almost. A banker's son in Prescott, handsome, rich. Turned out he was sleeping with his own stepmother. Dan was silent, but in the darkness, she thought she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. You think that's funny? She demanded. a hint of a smile in her own voice. "I think the stepmother has terrible taste," he said, his voice completely deadpan. Cora actually laughed. A real laugh this time. It felt good, like a drink of cool water after a day in the sun. "Was that a joke, Cole? Did the human rock just tell a joke?" Before he could answer, his entire body went rigid. "Shh," he hissed, his hand instinctively going to his rifle. He was looking up toward the rim of the canyon. Cora followed his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs. At first, she saw nothing but rock and shadow. Then she saw it, a tiny flicker of light, a match being struck, then quickly extinguished. It was gone in a second, but it had been there. Someone was up there, watching them. "They found us," she breathed, her earlier laughter turning to ash in her mouth. "They were never lost," Dan corrected, his voice a deadly whisper. "They were hurting us." He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "Come on. We have to move, now." The brief moment of warmth between them was gone, replaced by the cold, hard reality of the hunt. They weren't escaping. They were being driven into a trap. And the canyon they had thought was a shelter was about to become a tomb. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up Cora's throat. They were trapped, boxed in a canyon with killers on the rim above them. But Dan was a study in absolute calm. He wasn't panicking, he was calculating. "The horses," he whispered, already pulling her deeper into the shadows. "They'll go for the horses first. Try to leave us stranded." He pointed to a narrow fissure in the canyon wall, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "Get in there. Don't come out. No matter what you hear." "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. He gave her a look that was both grim and reassuring. "I'm going to make some noise." He disappeared into the darkness before she could protest. Cora squeezed into the crevice, the cold stone pressing against her back. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She drew the pistol from her hip, the weight of it a small, inadequate comfort. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The silence was absolute, heavy. It was a waiting game, a contest of nerves. Then the night exploded. A rifle shot cracked from the canyon rim, the sound ricocheting off the rock walls like a thunderclap. A second shot followed, then a third. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness, revealing the silhouettes of at least 3 men perched above. Cora held her breath, her knuckles white on the grip of her pistol. She couldn't see Dan. She didn't know where he was. Then from a place she didn't expect, far down the canyon, away from their camp. Dan's rifle answered. He fired once. A single clean shot. A scream echoed from the rim, followed by the sickening sound of a body tumbling down the rocky slope. One down. The gunmen above went crazy, firing wildly into the darkness where they thought Dan was. Bullets sparked off the rocks, whining and ricocheting through the canyon. It was chaos, but it was calculated chaos. Dan was drawing their fire, making them expose their positions. He fired again, from a different spot this time. Another cry, this one of pain, not death. He had wounded another one. He was a ghost in the darkness, a phantom marksman picking them off one by one. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the gunfire. The terrified whinny of a horse. Cora peered out from her hiding spot and saw a figure rappelling down the canyon wall, heading straight for their tethered horses. He was trying to cut them loose, to leave them on foot in the middle of the desert. She didn't think. She acted. She leveled her pistol, took a deep breath to steady her shaking hands, and fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The man grunted, his hand flying to his shoulder. He dropped his knife, but he was still coming. Cora fired again. This time he cried out and scrambled back up the rope, disappearing over the rim. She had done it. She had saved the horses. Adrenaline surged through her, hot and intoxicating. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't a victim. The gunfire from above stopped. There was a moment of tense silence. Then the sound of men shouting to each other, their voices filled with confusion and retreat. They were pulling back. For now. A few minutes later, Dan materialized out of the darkness, appearing at her side so silently he made her jump. He had a bloody cut on his cheek, but otherwise he was unharmed. He looked at her, then at the spot where the man had been. "Nice shot," he said, his voice low. "You told me to stay put," she said, her own voice shaky but defiant. You also told me you didn't give orders, he countered. He glanced up at the rim. They're gone, but they'll be back. They know we're armed. They know we'll fight. Next time, they'll be more careful. He checked on the horses, calming them with a soft voice and a gentle hand. Cora watched him, seeing him in a new light. He wasn't just a stoic lawman. He was a warrior, moving through the battlefield of his own life with a deadly grace. He was exactly the man her father said he was. We can't stay here, he said, turning back to her. They'll be watching the canyon entrance. We have to find another way out. He looked at the notebook, which she still clutched in her hand. That map of your father's, does it show a way through these mountains? She opened it, her hand still trembling slightly. They scanned the pages together by the faint moonlight, their heads close. Here, she said, pointing to a series of wavy lines next to the pictograph for the needles. He wrote, "The serpent's spine offers the back door." Dan's eyes narrowed in recognition. The serpent's spine. It's a ridge. Treacherous. Most people think it's impassable. But it's not, she asked. Not if you know the way, he said. A flicker of something crossed his face, a shadow of a painful memory. I've been there before, a long time ago. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Cora was beginning to understand that every corner of this land held a piece of his past, and not all of them were good. It'll take us right to the base of Painted Mesa, he continued, his voice all business again. But the trail is narrow. One wrong step, and it's a 1,000-foot drop. We'll have to lead the horses. He looked at her, his gaze searching her face in the dark. Are you ready for that? She met his look without flinching. After tonight, Marshal, I think I'm ready for anything. He gave a slow nod of approval. They gathered their things and under the cover of darkness, began to lead their horses toward the most dangerous path in the territory, leaving the dead man in the canyon behind them as a grim marker of how far they had come, and a chilling reminder of how far they still had to go. The serpent's spine was aptly named. It was a knife-edge ridge of rock that snaked its way between two towering peaks, with sheer drops on either side that fell away into bottomless shadow. The wind howled around them, a physical force that threatened to tear them from the narrow path. They moved slowly, leading the horses, their boots dislodging small stones that seemed to fall for an eternity before vanishing into the abyss. Dan went first, his feet sure and steady, his hand never far from the neck of his Mustang. Cora followed, her heart a cold, tight knot in her chest. She forced herself not to look down, focusing instead on the back of Dan's shirt, on the steady rhythm of his steps. It was an act of pure trust. She was putting her life in his hands, and she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that he would not let her fall. Hours passed in a grueling, silent ordeal. By the time the sun began to rise, painting the eastern sky in brutal shades of orange and red, they had crossed the ridge. They stood on a high plateau, exhausted and wind-battered, looking down at the sprawling, multi-hued landscape of the Painted Mesa. It was beautiful and terrifying, a land of stark, raw power. Dan pointed to a cluster of crumbling adobe buildings nestled in a canyon at the foot of the mesa. Fort Hayden, he said, his voice rough. It was decommissioned years ago. Abandoned. Cora looked at the notebook in her hands, a sudden realization dawning on her. She flipped to a page with a detailed sketch of a fort with one wall partially collapsed, just like the one below. Next to it was a symbol she hadn't understood before. Z-17. My father was here, she whispered. This is what the map leads to. They made their way down to the abandoned fort, the silence of the place pressing in on them. It was a ghost town, a monument to forgotten wars and broken promises. The main gate hung open on a single rusted hinge. Weeds grew through the cracked floors of the barracks. As they walked through the deserted courtyard, Dan suddenly froze. He held up a hand for silence, his head cocked, listening. Cora listened too, but she heard nothing but the wind whistling through the broken buildings. What is it? She whispered. Hoofprints, he said, pointing to the ground. Shod horse. Recent. Within the last day. Her blood ran cold. Jack's men. No, Dan said, his eyes narrowed as he studied the tracks. This is an army horse, and only one. They drew their weapons, moving cautiously through the ruins. They checked the stables, the mess hall, the collapsed officers' quarters. All empty. Finally, they came to the old storeroom. The thick wooden door had been forced open. Inside, it was dark and smelled of dust and decay. Dan stepped in first, his rifle raised. Cora followed close behind. The room was filled with broken crates and rotting supplies, and in the far corner, half hidden in the shadows, was a man. He was sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him. He wore the tattered remnants of a U.S. Army Scout's uniform, and he had a gaping, bloody wound in his gut. He looked up as they entered, his eyes unfocused. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he rasped, a bloody smile twisting his lips. "The Apache who came back from the dead." Dan stared at the man, his face a mask of disbelief and shock. "Briggs?" he said, his voice barely a whisper. Cora gasped. It was the man with the scar, the one she'd seen in San Miguel, the one who rode with Jack. But he wasn't a threat now. He was dying. Briggs coughed, a wet, rattling sound, and spat a glob of blood onto the dusty floor. "Hello, Dan. Long time no see. Not since you left me for dead on that mountain." Dan's face went pale under his tan. "I thought you were dead?" Briggs finished for him. "Yeah, well, I'm hard to kill." He took a swig of whiskey, wincing in pain. "Jack did this. We had a disagreement about the profits. He shot me and left me here to rot." He looked at Cora, his eyes clearing for a moment. "He's got the girl, Franklin's kid." Cora's heart stopped. "What?" "Not you," Briggs clarified, waving a weak hand. "The other one. The Apache girl. The one Franklin was hiding." Cora and Dan exchanged a look of utter confusion. Another girl? What was he talking about? "Frank didn't have another daughter," Cora said. Briggs let out a wheezing laugh. "He did. Not by blood. He found her years ago. Her family was massacred. He took her in, raised her as his own, kept her secret, kept her safe. Her name is Morning Sun." Dan's whole body went rigid, as if he'd been turned to stone. "Where?" he demanded, his voice shaking with an emotion Cora had never heard before. Briggs pointed a trembling finger toward a large, sealed crate in the corner of the room. The crate marked Z-17. "Frank was smarter than any of us. He knew Jack would come for him. He hid her, in there, with enough food and water for a week." Dan was across the room in a second, prying at the lid of the crate with his knife. Cora was right behind him, her mind struggling to process the impossible revelation. Her father had another daughter, a secret sister. Dan ripped the lid off the crate, and inside, huddled in the darkness, was a young girl, no more than 15 years old. She had wide, terrified eyes and long black hair. She was Apache. She looked at Dan, and her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and a dawning, unbelievable hope. "Dan," she whispered, her voice small. Dan reached into the crate and gently lifted her out. He held her, his arms wrapped around her, his face buried in her hair. And Cora saw something she never thought she would see. She saw Dan Cole cry. Silent tears tracked paths through the dust and blood on his face. "Morning Sun," he choked out. "I thought I'd lost you." The girl clung to him, sobbing. Cora stood frozen, watching them, feeling like an intruder in a story that had started long before she had arrived. She looked at Briggs, who was watching the scene with a strange, tired expression. "Who is she?" Cora asked him, her voice barely audible. Briggs took another pull from his bottle. "She's his sister," he said, his voice fading. "Dan Cole's little sister. The one he thought was murdered with the rest of his family 10 years ago." The world tilted on its axis. The notebook wasn't just a map to a place. The secret wasn't about gold or guns. It was about a person. And Franklin Dwight hadn't just been protecting a map. He had been protecting the last living piece of Dan Cole's soul. The revelation hit Cora like a physical blow. Dan had a sister he thought was dead for a decade, and her father, the man she'd barely known, had been secretly raising her, protecting her. The whole world had been turned upside down. Dan was still holding his sister, Morning Sun, whispering to her in Apache, his voice thick with emotions Cora couldn't begin to name. The girl was frail, trembling, but safe. Cora turned her attention back to Briggs. The dying man was slumped against the wall, his breathing shallow and ragged. "Why?" Cora asked him, her voice sharp. "Why would my father do this? Why keep her a secret?" Briggs managed a grim smile. Because Frank knew things. He knew who was behind the massacre of Dan's family. It wasn't just some random raid. It was ordered, paid for, by a man high up in the territorial government, a man who wanted the silver on their land. He coughed, a spasm of pain racking his body. Frank found the girl, the only survivor. He couldn't go to the law because the law was dirty. So he hid her, raised her. He was waiting, biding his time, collecting proof. He gestured weakly toward Cora. "That notebook, it's not just a map. It's his proof. Names, dates, bribes paid to army officers. It's all in there, hidden in the code. That's the real treasure Jack is after. He's not just a gang leader. He's the government's cleanup crew." Everything clicked into place. The coded messages, the military symbols, the relentless pursuit. It was never just about a few crates of stolen guns. It was about a conspiracy that went to the very top. And her father had been the only one brave enough or foolish enough to try and expose it. Dan finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but clear now, blazing with a new and terrible purpose. He gently set Morning Sun down and walked over to Briggs. He knelt beside the dying man. "Who?" Dan asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Who gave the order?" Briggs looked at him, a flicker of the old animosity in his eyes. "Why should I tell you? You left me to die once." "I didn't know you were alive," Dan said, his voice raw. "I searched for you, for all of you, for days." Briggs seemed to consider this. The fight was draining out of him, replaced by a weary resignation. "His name is Maddox," he finally rasped. "Colonel J. Maddox. He runs the whole territory from behind a desk in Prescott. Jack works for him." Maddox. The name hung in the air like a death sentence. Dan's face was a mask of cold fury. This was the man who had destroyed his world, murdered his family, and stolen his sister. And now he had a name. "Where is Jack heading?" Dan demanded. "Mesa Ridge," Briggs breathed, his voice barely a whisper now. "There's a cave system under the ridge. That's where they're holding the last shipment of guns. And the gold to pay off the buyers. Maddox is supposed to meet him there in 2 days." His eyes started to glaze over. "He'll kill the girl, you know. Can't have any loose ends." Dan stood up, his decision made. He looked at Cora, and for the first time, she saw the real Dan Cole. Not the stoic marshal, not the bitter scout, but the Apache warrior whose family had been wronged. "You need to take her," he said, nodding toward Morning Sun. "Take her and ride north. Don't stop until you reach the border." Cora stared at him, aghast. "What? No, I'm not leaving you. We're in this together, remember? That stupid piece of paper we signed. It wasn't just a legal shield. It was a promise." He shook his head. "This isn't your fight anymore, Cora." "The hell it isn't," she shot back, her own anger flaring. "They killed my father. They burned down a town to get to me. This has been my fight from the very beginning. You don't get to cut me out now." Morning Sun, who had been watching them with wide, intelligent eyes, spoke up for the first time. Her voice was soft but steady. "I am not running either," she said in perfect English. "These men took my family, my first family, and my second. I will not hide in the dark any longer." Dan looked from his sister's determined face to Cora's defiant one. He was outnumbered. A slow, tired smile touched his lips. "My father always said Dwight women were more stubborn than a mule in a hailstorm," he said to Cora. He was right. He looked around the dusty storeroom, at the 2 women who were now his responsibility, his army. He looked at the dying man who had given them their target, and he looked at the notebook, the key to it all. "All right," he said, his voice filled with a new resolve. "Briggs said Maddox is meeting Jack in 2 days. That means we have less than 48 hours to hit them first. At Mesa Ridge." He began to formulate a plan, his mind sharp and clear. "They'll be expecting an attack from the front. But your father's map—" He took the notebook from Cora. "He marked another way in, an old mining tunnel. The serpent's spine offers the back door." Cora's eyes lit up. He wasn't talking about the ridge. He was talking about the caves. Exactly, Dan confirmed. It leads right into the heart of their stronghold. He looked at Cora, then at his sister. It's a long shot. It's probably suicide, but it's the only chance we have. Then that's the chance we'll take, Cora said, her voice steady. Morning Sun nodded in agreement. The three of them stood together in the ruins of the forgotten fort, the warrior, the survivor, and the avenger, a makeshift family forged in grief and bound by a singular purpose: justice. As Briggs breathed his last ragged breath in the corner, a new and dangerous alliance was born. They weren't running anymore. They were going to war. They left Fort Hayden under the cover of twilight, a trinity of ghosts moving through a dying landscape. Dan led the way, his senses on high alert, reading the terrain like a book he had known his whole life. Morning Sun rode behind him, her small frame upright and proud. She was no longer the terrified girl in the crate. She was the daughter of a chief and the sister of a warrior, and it showed in the set of her jaw and the focus in her eyes. Cora brought up the rear, the weight of her father's notebook in her satchel a constant reminder of the stakes. She was no longer just running for her life. She was fighting for her father's legacy, for the truth he had died to protect. The plan was desperate, bordering on insane. They would use the old mining tunnel to get inside Jack's stronghold in the Mesa Ridge Caves. Once inside, their objectives were threefold: secure the evidence against Maddox, retrieve the stolen gold and weapons, and make sure Jack and his men never hurt anyone ever again. They rode through the night, the moon their only guide. Dan paused at the top of a rise, pointing to a dark scar in the side of the distant Mesa Ridge. "That's it," he said. "The entrance to the tunnel. We'll reach it just before dawn." They dismounted and made their camp in a small, hidden arroyo. Dan rationed out some dried jerky and water. As they ate in silence, Cora studied the two siblings. They spoke quietly to each other in Apache, their words a soft, flowing river of sound. She saw a decade of lost time being bridged in that single conversation. She saw Dan's face soften, the hard lines around his eyes easing as he looked at his sister. He was not just a marshal or a scout, he was a brother, and he would tear the world apart to keep his sister safe. "He taught me to read," Morning Sun said, suddenly switching to English, looking at Cora. "Your father. He gave me books. He told me knowledge was a weapon no one could take from you." Cora's throat felt tight. "He was a good man," she said quietly. "He was a complicated man," Morning Sun corrected gently, "but he was brave. He died protecting me." Dan looked at Cora, his eyes conveying a message of shared grief and understanding that went beyond words. The wall between them was gone, replaced by a bond forged in the crucible of shared loss and a common enemy. This was their family now, a broken, battered, but fiercely loyal clan of three against the world. As dawn approached, they made their way to the tunnel entrance. It was a dark, gaping maw in the rock face, partially hidden by overgrown brush. The air flowing out of it was cold and smelled of damp earth and something metallic, like old blood. "Stay close," Dan said, lighting a torch. "These old tunnels can be unstable." He went in first, rifle at the ready. Morning Sun followed, her eyes wide but fearless. Cora came last, her pistol in her hand. The tunnel was narrow and claustrophobic. Wooden support beams, slick with moisture, groaned under the weight of the mountain above them. Their footsteps echoed unnervingly in the oppressive silence. After about 10 minutes of walking, the tunnel opened up into a larger cavern. In the center of the cavern was a deep, circular shaft that plunged into darkness. A rickety-looking crank and pulley system stood beside it, a frayed rope disappearing into the abyss. "This is a ventilation shaft," Dan whispered, holding the torch over the edge. "It goes straight down to the main cave system." Morning Sun pointed to a series of carvings on the cavern wall. "These are old clan markings," she said. "My people use these caves for ceremonies. They are sacred." Cora's eyes went to the notebook. She flipped to the last page, where her father had drawn a crude map of the caves. He had marked this very spot, and next to it, he had written a single phrase: "The truth lies at the bottom." Dan checked the rope on the pulley. It was old, but it seemed strong enough. "It's the only way down," he said. "They'll have guards at all the other entrances. They'll never expect anyone to come from above. He looked at Cora and Morning Sun. I'll go first. I'll signal when it's clear. He secured the rope around his waist and, without a moment's hesitation, stepped off the edge and into the blackness. Cora and Morning Sun worked the crank, feeding him the rope, their muscles straining. It seemed to take forever. Every creak of the old machinery sent a fresh wave of fear through Cora. Finally, the rope went slack. They waited. The silence from the pit was absolute. Had he made it? Was it a trap? Then they heard it, a faint whistle from below. 3 short notes, the all-clear signal. Cora looked at Morning Sun. You next, she said. The girl nodded, her face pale but resolute. They secured the rope around her, and she followed her brother into the darkness. Now it was Cora's turn. She tied the rope, took a deep breath, and stepped into the void. The descent was terrifying. The rough rock walls scraped past her in the dark. The air grew colder, heavier. Then strong hands grabbed her, guiding her onto a solid ledge. Dan was there, his face grim in the faint torchlight. Morning Sun was beside him. They were in a high, narrow cavern that overlooked a much larger one below. And in that cavern, lit by a dozen lanterns and a large bonfire, was Rattlesnake Jack's army. There were at least 15 men, laughing, drinking, and sorting through stacks of weapons and heavy-looking crates. In the center of the cavern, sitting on a makeshift throne of ammunition boxes, was Jack himself. He was leaner and meaner than Cora had imagined, with cold, dead eyes that seemed to miss nothing. And standing next to him, looking nervous and out of place, was a man in a pristine colonel's uniform. Maddox. There it is, Cora whispered, her eyes fixed on a heavy iron strongbox near the fire. The evidence. My father's papers have to be in there. Dan pointed to the other side of the cavern, where a dozen horses were tied. That's our way out. His eyes were blazing with a cold, controlled fire. Cora, you and Morning Sun create a diversion. Something loud. Something that will draw their attention to the north end of the cave. What will you be doing? Cora asked. Dan looked at Jack and Maddox, a predatory smile touching his lips for the first time. It was not a pleasant sight. I'm going to have a conversation with the man who murdered my family. The final battle was about to begin, and in the sacred caves of the Apache, blood was about to be spilled once more. The plan was simple, audacious, and very, very likely to get them all killed. Dan had pointed out a stack of crates on the far side of the cavern, piled high and perilously close to the bonfire. Inside some of them, he'd recognized the markings for blasting powder. That would be their diversion. While Cora and Morning Sun made their way along the high ledge to get into position, Dan would slip down to the cavern floor, using the shadows and stacks of supplies for cover. He moved like smoke, a phantom in the flickering firelight, his focus absolute. Cora and Morning Sun reached the spot directly above the powder crates. The heat from the bonfire washed over them in waves. Below, the outlaws were oblivious, celebrating a victory they hadn't yet won. Cora looked at the young girl beside her. Are you ready? She asked. Morning Sun didn't answer with words. She simply pulled a small, beautifully carved bow and a single arrow from a pouch on her back. The tip of the arrow was wrapped in a small, oil-soaked cloth. She looked at Cora and gave a single, determined nod. Cora took a deep breath. She pulled out the old Colt Navy that had been her father's, the one they had found at Fort Hayden. It felt heavy and solid in her hand, a piece of him that was still with her. This was for him. Down below, Dan had reached the edge of the firelight, hidden behind a stack of saddles not 20 feet from where Maddox and Jack were examining the contents of the strongbox. He could hear their voices clearly. It's all here, Maddox was saying, holding up a sheaf of papers. DeWitt's ledgers, every transaction, every bribe. Once we burn this, it's like it never happened. Jack laughed, a harsh, grating sound. And what about the girl, the Apache brat? She's a loose end, Maddox said coldly. Find her. Kill her. Kill the marshal, too. No witnesses. A wave of pure, cold rage washed over Dan. He drew the heavy knife from his belt, his knuckles white. Not yet. He had to wait for the signal. High above, Morning Sun lit the tip of her arrow from the torch Cora was holding. She knocked the arrow, drew the bowstring back, and took aim. Her target wasn't a person. It was a half-open crate of blasting powder. She let the arrow fly. It sailed through the air, a tiny comet of fire, and landed squarely in the open crate. For a second, nothing happened. Then the world erupted. The explosion was deafening, a massive concussion of fire and force that sent men, crates, and flaming debris flying through the air. The cavern was plunged into chaos. Men screamed, scrambling for cover, their ears ringing, their eyes blinded by the flash. The diversion was more successful than they could have imagined. In that first moment of stunned confusion, Dan moved. He burst from the shadows like an avenging spirit, a blur of motion and violence. He took down the two guards closest to Jack before they even knew what was happening. His knife was a whisper of steel, silent and deadly. Jack and Maddox spun around, their faces masks of shock. Jack drew his pistol, but Dan was too fast. He lunged forward, not at Jack, but at the strongbox. He grabbed it, heaved it with a surge of adrenaline, and hurled it toward Cora, who had repelled halfway down the cavern wall. "Cora, the proof!" he yelled. Cora swung on the rope, catching the heavy box and securing it. The outlaws were starting to recover, opening fire. Bullets sparked around her as she scrambled back up the rope. Morning sun provided cover fire from above, her small bow a surprisingly effective weapon in the enclosed space. Her arrows were silent, swift, and deadly accurate, finding the gaps in the outlaws' defenses. Now Dan turned his attention to Maddox. The colonel was fumbling for his weapon, his face pale with terror. He was a politician, not a fighter. Dan was on him in two strides, the point of his knife pressed against the man's throat. "It's over, Maddox," Dan snarled. "You're going to tell the world what you did." But before he could disarm him, Rattlesnake Jack recovered. He didn't go for Dan. He saw Cora, high on the rope, vulnerable, a perfect target. He raised his pistol and fired. The shot echoed through the cavern. Dan saw it happen in slow motion. He saw the puff of dust from the rope above Cora's head. The rope, frayed and old, snapped. Cora screamed as she fell. Dan didn't hesitate. He shoved Maddox aside and sprinted, launching himself through the air. He caught her, his body crashing into hers, and they tumbled to the cavern floor, a tangled mess of limbs. The impact was brutal, knocking the wind out of both of them. But she was alive. They were alive. Jack stood over them, a triumphant sneer on his face, his pistol aimed directly at Dan's head. "End of the line, Marshal," he hissed. But as he prepared to pull the trigger, a shadow fell over him. He looked up. Morning sun stood on the ledge above him, her face a mask of righteous fury. She didn't have another arrow, but she didn't need one. With a fierce cry, she pushed a massive, precariously balanced boulder at the edge of the cliff. The rock, weighing hundreds of pounds, teetered for a second and then fell. Jack's eyes went wide with terror. He had just enough time to scream before the boulder crashed down, crushing him instantly. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the groans of the wounded. It was over. Dan staggered to his feet, helping Cora up. She was bruised, shaken, but otherwise unharmed. They looked at each other, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had survived. Then they looked up at Morning Sun, the small girl who had just saved them both. She stood on the ledge, looking down, not with triumph, but with a deep, profound sadness for all the violence, for all the loss. They rounded up the remaining outlaws, tied up Colonel Maddox, and gathered the strongbox. They had the proof. They had the man who gave the orders. They had won. As they led the horses out of the cave and into the clean, bright light of a new day, Cora looked at Dan. He was bruised and bleeding, but he stood taller than she had ever seen him. He had faced the ghost of his past and had not flinched. He put his arm around his sister, who leaned against him, her own ordeal finally over. Cora walked over and stood on his other side. The three of them stood there for a long moment, watching the sunrise paint the mesa in colors of hope and promise. They were a strange, broken family, born from a tragedy, but they were a family nonetheless. And for the first time in a very long time, they were not looking back at the darkness, but forward into the light. The journey to Prescott was long and grim. They rode with Colonel Maddox securely tied in the saddle, his face a sullen mask of defeated arrogance. The captured outlaws were roped together, a miserable procession of beaten men. But for Dan, Cora, and Morning Sun, every mile was a victory, a step away from the bloody darkness of Mesa Ridge and towards some semblance of justice. They didn't talk much. The events in the cave had left their mark, a shared trauma that needed no words. They rode as a single unit, watching each other's backs, a silent, efficient team. The strong box filled with her father's ledgers was Cora's constant responsibility. It was the legacy he had left her, the truth he had died for, and she would have guarded it with her life. When they finally saw the territorial capital of Prescott on the horizon, a sprawling town of brick buildings and false promises, it didn't feel like a destination. It felt like another battlefield. Dan knew that Maddox had allies here, powerful men who would do anything to keep the contents of that strong box from seeing the light of day. He handed the prisoners over to the ranking federal marshal, a man he knew to be honest, and laid out the story. He presented the ledgers, the signed confessions he'd forced from the captured men, and the testimony of Colonel Maddox himself, who had crumbled completely once he realized the game was up. The federal marshal listened, his face growing grimmer with every word. When Dan was finished, the marshal looked at him, then at Cora and Morning Sun. "You three," he said, his voice filled with a grudging respect, "have just kicked over the biggest hornet's nest in this territory. Half the men who run this town are named in these papers." The news spread like wildfire. The arrest of a decorated colonel, the uncovering of a conspiracy involving land grabs, weapons running, and murder. It was a scandal that shook the territory to its foundations. For days, Dan and Cora were tied up in depositions, telling their story over and over again to federal investigators. Morning Sun, protected from the ordeal, stayed in a room at the hotel, quietly recovering, slowly coming to terms with her newfound freedom and her long-lost brother. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of testimony, Dan and Cora sat on the balcony of their hotel room, watching the sunset. The air was cool, and for the first time in weeks, they could breathe without the constant fear of being hunted. "It's really over, isn't it?" Cora said softly, more to herself than to him. "The fight is," Dan replied, his eyes on the horizon. "The rest, the healing, that takes longer." They sat in a comfortable silence for a while. The sham marriage that had been born of desperation had somehow, along the trail of blood and dust, become something real. They had saved each other, trusted each other, fought for each other. They had become partners in the truest sense of the word. "What will you do now?" Cora asked. "You can't go back to being a marshal in some forgotten town. Not after this." He shook his head. "No. I'm done wearing a badge for a government that hires men like Maddox." He looked over at her, his expression serious. "I was thinking of buying some land, north of here, a place where my sister can grow up in peace, a place where a man can forget the sound of gunfire." Cora's heart skipped a beat. "And would there be room," she started, her voice hesitant, "for a stubborn, sharp-tongued woman who doesn't cook or clean?" Dan turned to face her fully. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping gently around hers. "I was thinking," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "that I might need someone to help me build a schoolhouse." She smiled back, a real, genuine smile that lit up her whole face. "I think I could do that." It wasn't a dramatic declaration of love. It was something better. It was a quiet promise of a shared future, a life to be built together from the ashes of their past. A few days later, it was all settled. The government, eager to avoid a larger scandal, offered Dan a generous reward and a full pardon for any unconventional methods he may have used. He took the money and bought a piece of land near a river, just as he'd said. He, Cora, and Morning Sun left Prescott without a backward glance. They found their new home in a valley nestled between rolling hills, a place so green and peaceful it felt like another world. Dan started building their house with his own two hands. Morning Sun, free from the shadows for the first time in her life, explored the fields and learned the names of the wildflowers. And Cora started planning her school. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their half-built home, Watching the stars come out in the vast, clear sky, Cora pulled a piece of paper from her pocket. It was their marriage certificate, the one signed in the dusty, candle-lit church in San Miguel. It felt like a lifetime ago. "You know," she said, looking at him, her eyes shining in the twilight. "We never did have a proper wedding." Dan took the paper from her. He looked at it for a moment, then carefully tore it into small pieces and let the wind carry them away into the darkness. He turned back to her and gently cupped her face in his hands. "Cora Dweet," he said, his voice low and steady, "will you marry me?" She laughed, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes, Dan Cole, I will." They sealed their promise not with a contract born of fear, but with a kiss born of love, respect, and the shared knowledge that they had walked through hell together and come out the other side, stronger. They had found their peace. They had found their home. They had found each other. And that was a truth worth fighting for. Thank you for sticking with Dan and Cora's story all the way to the end. It's tales of survival, courage, and unexpected love like this that I truly enjoy sharing with you. If this story moved you, please give the video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. It means the world to me, and it ensures you won't miss the next adventure. Thanks for listening.